You're listening to episode 84 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Katherine MacLean speaks with us today about a new study on the effects of the psychoactive drug Psilocybin on the personality trait of openness. Hi, everyone. This week, as with last week, we're enjoying the benefits of the kindness of others in sharing their work in a very timely fashion. I was very happy to get an email a few days ago from our friend Katherine MacLean at Johns Hopkins with a preview of a new study that was scheduled for release this week, where you're able to get together and talk about the study, some of the corollaries with meditation practice, and get this episode complete and to you within a day or so of the press release. The study itself brings up some very interesting questions. Do the causal conditions of our life-changing experiences matter? If it harms no one and is positively transformative? What are those changes in personality? Do they last? And how do we know they're more than just self-reported impressions? Katherine MacLean grew up in Connecticut and received her bachelor's degree at Dartmouth College in the woods of New Hampshire. After a 2-year stint recording brain activity in rhesus monkeys, she transitioned to study primates who could talk about their subjective experiences, humans. During her graduate studies at the University of California, Davis, she worked with Ron Mangan on the studies of visual attention and with Cliff Sarin on the Shamatha Project, a longitudinal study of changes in behavior and brain function during intensive meditation training. She received her PhD in psychology in the fall of 2009, and subsequently joined the Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit within the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine as a postdoctoral fellow. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice lemonade. It's one of the last days of summer for us to enjoy that. And our guest today is our friend Dr. Katherine MacLean. Katherine, thanks for being here.
Hi, Ted. Thanks for having me back. It's been a little over a year. It's crazy how the time flew.
It does. It's been a very active year, and I'm very glad to see you here. And I wanted to thank you. And I'll just tell my listeners about this, that I had an email from you this week, just a day or so ago, about a study that's just coming out tomorrow as the time we're recording this. And by the time folks are listening to it this coming weekend, it will have just come out on some of your research since we last spoke. And for folks who are listening, the episode page has some very important links on this one. First is to Katherine's first interview with us, episode 23. Wow, 23. We were so young then. And then with your colleague, Dr. Roland Griffiths, in episode 69. And for folks listening...
Wow, how many there's been?
This will be episode 84. So,
wow.
Yeah, we've had a few. And I would encourage folks who are listening to listen to both of those, episode 23 and episode 69, because that will give you a little bit of background about what we're going to be talking about today. And hopefully there will also be a link to, I'll have my fingers crossed for you on this, there is a possibility of an ABC News piece going out, an interview with Katherine and Roland about this study as well. So it's very timely, and Katherine, thank you so much for letting me know about this.
Yeah, it's great.
So the study that's coming out is in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, and the study itself is called Mystical Experiences Occasioned by the Hallucinogen Psilocybin. I've been practicing saying that because I didn't do so well with Roland. Lead to increases in the personality domain of openness. And that was co-authored by you, Catherine, and Matthew Johnson and Roland Griffiths. Catherine, tell us a little bit about this specific study and what you were looking at.
Well, this study was an attempt to kind of combine the the subject power. So all of the participants from the two studies that Roland and Matt have accomplished over the last several years, combine those participants and look for changes in personality. And the reason that we needed to kind of combine the studies is personality is usually very stable. And to give the listeners kind of a little bit of background, um, the personality domain in psychology has been one of the most rigorously and extensively researched domains in psychology. And of course, there are debates like in any domain, but in this particular area of psychology, there's a surprising level of consensus in terms of what personality is. Um, the personality that we wanted to look at were core personality traits which aren't supposed to change once you're an adult. You can think about this as the personality that you kind of consider to be your identity, yourself. And although we might imagine kind of thinking back to when we were kids or high school, college, early 20s, maybe imagining some changes in our personality over that time period. But if we think about kind of who we are as adults, that's pretty stable over the lifetime. And in fact, about 85% of personality, give or take, is determined by your genes and it's heritable. So that doesn't leave that much room to change and push personality around. And it's probably an even smaller percentage that could change as a result of a single life event. So this kind of type of personality change has never really been shown in the area of personality psychology, although if you look at a lot of papers that say personality is generally stable, but it should change following really significant life events, life altering, either positive or negative events, which are really hard to examine in the laboratory. I mean, imagine what would you have to come up with in the lab to change someone's personality? Well, I mean, it probably never occurred to a lot of researchers that there was a way to look at this in the laboratory. I want to say that there has been a lot of really good correlational research done showing that people who have certain life experiences over time tend to change in this way or that. But it's impossible to say what caused what. So, getting back to this question of what kind of intervention could you imagine that's life altering? Well, an experience with a high dose of psilocybin um, is life altering in this sense that pretty much nothing else is in the laboratory. And so, not being a personality researcher by training, I did think it was really intriguing to look at changes in personality, particularly in this one domain called openness. And openness is one of these kind of aspects of personality that I kind of jokingly call it the Moulin Rouge aspect of personality because it's kind of something that you don't necessarily have to have, but it makes life a little bit more colorful and interesting to have it. It's related to kind of abstract thinking, imagination, fantasy, art, music, feelings. So it's kind of, the truth, beauty, and love domain of personality. And I'm sure those of you out there listening, you probably know if you're high in this or not, and you probably know people who are high in it, and maybe they're your kind of slightly wacky but really fun and interesting friends. So that's openness. Um, in terms of why it might be good to increase openness, it's related to intelligence and creativity. And by intelligence, I don't mean the kind of intelligence that, we think of as, you're kind of born with intelligence and that's all you've got, but more kind of flexible cognition and being able to think of creative ways to solve problems, think about things abstractly, kind of information processing. So to be able to increase that kind of openness would actually have a lot of benefits, I think. Um, so that was kind of setting the stage for what I looked at in the data. And by combining the two studies, I was able to look at the change in the group and to look for a signal that there was any increase in openness at all. And then once we found that signal, to look and see who exactly was increasing and who was staying the same. And we looked at that both a couple months after the high dose psilocybin session and again more than a year later to see if it was just kind of this transient kind of afterglow effect or if this was something fairly permanent that had shifted in people after their experience on psilocybin.
It's very interesting on the abstract. It says, intriguingly, double-blind controlled studies have shown that the classic hallucinogen psilocybin occasions uh, personally and spiritually significant mystical experiences, and I'm going to put brackets around mystical so we can talk
Mm-hmm.
about this in a second, that predict long-term changes in behaviors, attitudes, and values.
Yes.
And to me, that's it fits in quite well with the interview we also did with Eric Storley about this. For him, his experiences with hallucinogens were altering in a very positive way in
Mm-hmm.
his life, and this matches what you're talking about with the people who are part of the study. I do want us to take a look at the word mystical. I put brackets around it so we could chat about it.
Yep.
I want to make sure that folks who are listening to this being, the Secular Buddhist podcast, our use of the term mystical is not in the sense of anything supernatural. It
Right.
is a normal biological event. Catherine, maybe you can describe, I know there is a definition that
Mm-hmm.
has been used and it does appear in the paper. Maybe you could speak to that for a moment.
Sure. So, I think the term mystical, uh, there are probably other terms that these experiences could have been labeled, but, then maybe that label would become the thing that we'd have to put quotes around.
Right.
Um, I like to think of terms like illuminating. Um, Transcendent is an okay term, but again, it kind of calls to mind supernatural or other than this world here.
Right,
And
right.
but transcendent in terms of going beyond your kind of normal ways of experiencing the world. Um, the criteria that we used were developed by an early researcher in the field of hallucinogen research. So Walter Pankey did the original, what's called the Good Friday experiment, where he gave divinity students either psilocybin or an active control drug during the Good Friday sermon up in Cambridge in Boston and at the Marsh Chapel. And he showed that the students who were given psilocybin reported more of these kind of mystical qualities during a sermon that was, inherently an extremely spiritual experience for everyone involved. But they kind of even went above and beyond that while under the influence of psilocybin. The criteria that he developed, he actually was they were rooted in work that Stace had done, kind of saying, what do the experiences look like of the mystics kind of across history? Not just religious mystics, but kind of our profound thinkers, the human beings who have thought about the world in a way that's just kind of beyond our normal scope of, here's time and space and reality, and which kind of people across history wrote about experiences they had that kind of transcended this. So Stace kind of went through and said, okay, well, here's what I've seen that looks to be common across all of these descriptions. The core experience appears to be unity. And by unity, we mean either unity with kind of an internal world, and you could imagine this unity as, um, for the meditators out there, it might be how you imagine kind of an open awareness state where there isn't really a difference between you and the thing that's being observed, and yet there's still this duality, but somehow there's this paradoxical dissolving of um, the self versus other. but this kind of internal unity with um, that is kind of apart from the world. Then there's external unity, which means you literally feel connected with everything that you see, people, the world, the universe, kind of the cosmos. Um, these two forms of unity, it doesn't quite matter which one you have. Stace and also Pankey kind of argued that one person could have both. Some people tend to have one versus the other, depending on kind of how you're accessing it. But feeling connected to everything and losing that sense of self as being separate was really the core to this experience. So you could, instead of mystical, you could just call it a unity experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, where it becomes a little bit, and the supernatural piece, it doesn't have to be supernatural, but where it can become supernatural is how people talk about it.
Right.
So there are kind of aspects related to more interpretation. So do you interpret this unity as unity with God, unity with nature, unity with um, God who is actually you? You know, how do you kind of frame it? Um, but some of their kind of characteristics are you feel very joyful and blissful and peaceful during the experience. You lose your normal sense of time and space, almost to the extreme of feeling the original. So this Walter Pankey had this term called the eternal now, which I kind of like. So it's this continually being in the present moment, so much so that time no longer has a meaning, and also kind of transcending your normal sense of space. And there's an ineffability about these experiences, meaning that people try really hard to describe them and come up with criteria, obviously, like we're talking about, but nothing really exactly describes what the experience is like. And so people often say, oh, I can't really describe it until I talk to someone who's also had a similar experience. Um,
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges that we have. And a recent blog post um, talks about effing the ineffable, and on one of our friends' blogs, and it goes into that. The challenge is that as an external observer, how do you get your mind around that? How do you have an understanding such that you can really determine that yes, there's something that's happened. It's there is an event going on here, whether it's a perfectly natural biological one or other, whatever it may be. But if one can't communicate and articulate that in some fashion, of course, it's very challenging for outside observers to be able to analyze that and find
mhm,
out more about it. And one of the other descriptions that's included in the introduction to the paper is, and many of us have in our meditation practice lost the sense of time. It's been now, and we've had the great feelings of joy, and
mhm,
our physical sensations of space have
yep,
changed. And these are normal states. We typically associate these classically with various jhana states, and included with that, and it says so in the paper here, is an intuitive belief that the experience is a source of objective truth about the nature
mm,
of reality. And that's, of course, one of the challenges we have, and why I keep recommending Metzinger's book Ego Tunnel, because it very nicely describes that really what we experience still goes through our brains and our bodies,
yep,
and that this, in fact, this study and all others on psilocybin or any kind of chemical change that leads to these experiences show that at the very least these can be induced in a natural biological fashion.
mhm,
And so we're not saying that, oh no, you didn't have an experience. We're saying you are having an experience. Here's evidence that there is an experience. It's just, as you were saying, Catherine, how we discuss it.
yep.
That's where it can be a little bit tangled sometimes.
Yeah, this kind of this source of objective truth bit, this the name that again like to come up with all these terms is noetic quality.
Mm-hmm.
And noetic, I tend to shy away from these philosophical terms because frankly I can never remember exactly what the definition is, and then I'm always afraid that I'm kind of using it a little bit wrong. But my sense of that is that there is a form of knowing or wisdom that isn't necessarily rational or kind of logical. And so I think the noetic quality was not to say that it is the truth of the universe, that everything is connected and I don't exist and I'm just the same as everything else that I see and everything is joy and peace. Not that that is the truth, but that it feels about as close to the truth as anything else I've observed. And this was to differentiate these experiences from you might have an experience like in a dream where during the dream it feels pretty real, but then once you kind of come out of the dream, you're like, that was just a dream.
Right.
Dream, but it was, I'm not going to say that's how the universe operates. These experiences have a different quality of kind of, heaviness that it's like there's something in here that's a kernel of truth that seems not to be illusory or dreamlike. And, for especially the meditators in the audience, these kinds of states of consciousness, I think, are very fertile ground to examine um, your kind of assumptions about what the true state of the universe is and reality and your perception of reality. Um, Not to say that everyone has to, have an experience like this to challenge their kind of their meditation practice, but I can easily see how, um, if you have a sense of being able to be present with and observe the normal fluctuations of your consciousness, then you kind of add to that this new way of experiencing and say, oh, okay, what is it like to be present with this state of consciousness? One that is incredibly profound and in either good or bad ways can kind of make you see the world a little bit differently or a lot differently.
A lot differently, and that's what a point that several people have made. And what Roland has done is he's done a couple of, for a science-minded folks in the audience, double-blinded control studies have demonstrated that a single psilocybin session occasions these experiences associated with positive changes in behaviors, attitudes, and values more than a year later. And this is what I really like to see in papers like this, independent ratings from participants, partners, coworkers, friends corroborate those
Mm-hmm.
first-person reports. So it isn't just self-reporting. There is also external verification of fundamental changes in a positive direction from the person who had these experiences.
Yeah. And I think the kind of the corollary to community observation for the things that we saw in this new report, personality changes, I think it opens the window to look at kind of well, okay, so people said they felt more creative, more able to abstractly think about issues. They felt more connected to feelings and art and music. Well, let's test that. Let's come up with objective measures, if we can, of fluid intelligence. Well, we've got some pretty good ones, but most people are familiar with them. They're the IQ tests, and they're not that great. So maybe we can come up with like other measures of information processing and flexible thinking and creativity. There are a lot more creativity measures now than there were when people first did this research with hallucinogens. Let's look at objective ways of measuring being in tune with others and your own feelings, producing art, listening to music. So it kind of opens this window into areas of research that people who were initially interested in looking at hallucinogens, they kind of jumped the gun and started trying to see if it made people more creative right away. And there was a really cool study that was done by Jim Fadiman and colleagues where they took university professors and other professionals in the community who were stuck on a problem. And this was a professional problem related to their careers. They'd just been kind of banging their head into a wall trying to figure out, why can't I see an answer to this problem? And they wanted to see if giving these people LSD, so a classic hallucinogen similar to psilocybin but not identical molecularly, if giving these people LSD helped them kind of have a breakthrough. So the kind of solution that isn't going to come by just kind of logically, rationally going through all the steps, but an aha moment and insight into a solution. Um, Basically, it was a great idea, and the follow through wasn't that great. They didn't kind of have in place really objective ways to decide whether people had had a breakthrough or not. I mean, talk about trying to, quantify mystical experience. Try to quantify an intellectual breakthrough moment.
Right.
you know,
Eureka!
who's going to be the judge of that unless you kind of solve, one of these big, engineering or technology problems that the rest of the world has been trying to solve for a long time. And so once you solve it, they're like, yep, that's the answer. It's kind of hard to pin down objectively. So I do think that, like the community observer ratings, we need other objective measures of these kinds of changes in openness to say, people weren't just imagining themselves to be more open. They actually are showing themselves to be more creative and in touch with their feelings and aesthetically interested in their lives.
And one of the things I wanted to ask about, and this is associated with how this is being reported and measured, is that I see in the measures section of the paper that there are several different screenings and scales that are used to determine these different levels to set your baseline.
Mm-hmm.
And tell us a little bit about those and setting the baseline, and then the measurements afterwards. How did that go, and what were some of the measures used?
Well, so the screening experience is pretty challenging. It involves, medical screening, psychiatric screening, as well as um, kind of baseline measurements on all sorts of domains in psychology, mostly questionnaire measures, although sometimes computer tasks. And um, that's just to get a really kind of broad sense of who people are, their characteristics, their qualities, their abilities when they come into the study. Before, I mean, they've interacted with some of the study team already, but really before they've entered any kind of official study intervention. And so in these first two studies, it included things like obviously the personality measure. And so the personality measure is 240 items. And they're kind of questions like, I like to try new foods, or when I go to a party, I like to talk to people in the room versus, hide in a corner. It's kind of these broad statements that you could imagine yourself in different scenarios and say, how do I do this? Does this generally describe me? So that's the personality measure. And then in addition, there are other, kind of questionnaires about spirituality and psychological functioning and, kind of attitudes and beliefs, the kind of the bread and butter of most of kind of social and cognitive psychology. In more recent work, we've kind of added other questionnaire measures about things like mindfulness, for example, or kind of these newer domains that have kind of infiltrated from meditation science into psychology. Um, then there's a whole set of measures that are taken shortly after the psilocybin effects resolve. So between the screening and the first psilocybin session, there's a significant amount of preparation that people go through, and I'm sure Roland talked about this in his interview with you. But basically, kind of a whole period of time where we're interacting with volunteers and learning about them so that they feel safe and that they trust us, and kind of establishing this rapport so that during the sessions they feel completely supported and safe to kind of go wherever their mind takes them. So there's kind of a lot of preparation kind of after the screening. And, you can imagine that that would change people too, going through this unique experience of having this kind of attention and support. Um, then they have their psilocybin session, which is, predominantly laying on a couch with eye shades and headphones, really going inward. Kind of, we like to use the phrase of letting the intellect go outside and play for the day, meaning, you know, we'll give you lots of material to work with when you come back, but for now I don't really need you to be trying to logically, rationally figure out this experience. I'm just going to have it and be present for the experience and then check it out later. Um, but basically, at the end of this day, we have them fill out several questionnaires related to possible effects that they might have had during the day. And included in this kind of battery are some questionnaires that allow us to get at what are these kind of mystical type effects. And I'm going to be a little bit vague so that anyone who's currently in the study or might be in future studies doesn't know exactly how we're testing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Able to say, well, it might not look like a mystical experience to anyone else, but I included the maximum answers on those specific items. So, um, but in addition to the mystical type effects, we also ask for all sorts of other effects that have nothing to do with the criteria I mentioned, including negative effects. So your kind of classic bad trip, anxiety, fear, that kind of thing. So that gives us our measure of the acute effects. And then again, a month or so later, we kind of give them either the whole battery that they did at screening or maybe a subset, including the personality. So what that gives us is a pre-post for personality. So at screening to post psilocybin, we have a change measure. Then we also have what happened in between pre and post, which is the session itself. And we can look at everyone who got psilocybin, but basically look at the people who had a particular experience on psilocybin, mystical type, and people who didn't. And to show that one group changes and the other group doesn't is a nice kind of within subject control that, or within study control that, you can't, if we just showed that the people who got a high dose showed an increase and the people who didn't get the high dose didn't show an increase, well, that's interesting. It's likely due to psilocybin, but it could also be due to all the other things I talked about, like the interaction with the study staff, trying a new experience for the first time, listening to this amazing musical soundtrack for 8 hours, that kind of thing. But the analysis that basically says the people who had the mystical experience showed an increase in openness, and those who did not have a mystical experience did not show the increase, allows us to say that it's something particular to the response to psilocybin and not just simply getting a high dose that determines this kind of long-term outcome. So I don't know if there were other kind of measures that I didn't talk about. Most of the measures for, like I said, at screening, it's mostly kind of taken from psychology of religion fields. The measures used on the session day are a little bit from kind of psychology of religion, but more so from the field of psychopharmacology, just kind of describing basic behavioral and cognitive and kind of, acute drug effects.
Yeah, yeah. And I see in the dose conditions there were a couple of studies, as you have mentioned, and there were in the first study it was either psilocybin and an active control
Mm-hmm.
drug in the other sessions, and then in study two, it was again psilocybin in a random assignment, ascending or descending order,
Right.
and a placebo as well, randomly,
Mm-hmm.
quasi-randomly inserted in the sequence, which to me, again, is nice to see because you do have some controls. It's not just here, every time you get this, it's going to be a high dose experience, and therefore
Mm-hmm.
they report the high dose experience. They
Right.
know whether it happens or not. And I'm presuming there's some double blinding in there where the results are given without knowledge of what particular dose they got. And that's fed later.
Right.
Okay, excellent. So tell me about the results. What were people reporting at the end of the study?
So I mentioned that this way that we measured personality. So we used the Neo personality inventory. Um, I mentioned earlier that personality psychology, despite remaining debates, there is a strong consensus that the Neo inventory is a good measure of personality across cultures. It doesn't just apply to American undergraduates taking, intro psychology. It's been given to thousands of people all over the world, and there are kind of five domains of personality that seem to be consistent. And, you could be high in one and low in another. You could be kind of average on all of them. And that kind of creates a picture of who you are. Having said that, there are probably maybe in 100 years we'll have another way of measuring personality really well that we all agree is the best way to measure personality. Um, but it works well. And so to get at these five domains, you have 240 items. And the nice thing about the way it's kind of set up is the questions are kind of scattered throughout. So it's not like all the openness questions occur together. So you could kind of start to see questions about fantasy and say, oh yeah, that sounds like something that psilocybin should increase. So I'm just going to start agreeing with all of them in a row.
Right,
They're
right.
they're scattered throughout, so you wouldn't necessarily be able to just pick which ones you wanted to increase. Um, and generally, like I said, people tend to stay the same on this measure, even after many years. Um, so people do that at screening and after psilocybin. And what we found is, in general, there was a small but significant increase in just openness and not the other four domains. The other domains are things like extroversion, so whether you are outgoing or not, neuroticism, which isn't necessarily what you think it is. It's more. I mean, it is maladaptive, but it's kind of depression, moodiness, tension, impulsivity, and it just has the label of neuroticism. Then there's conscientiousness, so showing up on time, being organized, that kind of thing. And agreeableness, which is what it sounds like. You care about others, you're a good citizen, you're cooperative, you don't cause fights too much, you keep your mouth shut when you should, those kinds of things. Um, People in our studies kind of stayed the same on all of those other domains, and it was only openness that increased. And within openness, it wasn't only kind of one aspect of openness, it was pretty much all parts of openness. And the paper kind of goes into this in a little bit more detail, but I touched on some of them earlier. So it's things like fantasy life, imagination. Um, there's a facet or an aspect called ideas, so that's kind of the intellectual side. There's aesthetics, art and music, feelings, values, which is kind of tolerance and open-mindedness, and actions. The only one that didn't change is actions. Actions are things like if you're like I think I mentioned the item, I like to try new foods, or if I had the opportunity, I might try, skydiving or something. Um, Actions tend to be things that are kind of, if you've tried those things, you've tried them, and possibly just having a single experience with psilocybin wouldn't all of a sudden make you go out and like Indian food if you had never tried it before.
Yeah.
It might, but it's not like the biggest thing that's probably going to change. So we found an increase in the group, small but significant. And then it seemed to be that this amount of increase was correlated with the strength of the mystical experience. So the people who had a stronger mystical experience, according to the criteria I talked about earlier, unity, positive mood, noetic quality, time and space kind of dissolving, and one thing that I left out, which I'm sure will kind of unnerve some of the audience, is sacredness, and we
Hmm.
can talk about that if you want.
Yeah, we should talk about that.
Uh, so people who were higher in those characteristics of their response to psilocybin showed bigger increases in openness. And the correlation was fairly reliable. So, higher mystical experience, higher increase in openness. So that was this kind of short-term result. 1 or 2 months after the session, people had higher openness. More than a year later, the difference between having a mystical experience and not became really clear. The people who had not had a mystical experience on their high dose were really, I mean, exactly the same as they had been at screening. So that result alone corroborates what other studies have shown, which personality doesn't change. And some people might argue, well, you found a change, but maybe your people were just kind of moving all over the place and the measurement wasn't as reliable as in other studies. And we can point to our group who didn't change and say, no, 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 it was really stable. The people who had a mystical experience, they increased, and that increase was maintained more than a year later. So basically, it dropped down a little bit, but not significant, and still significantly higher than at the beginning. And when I'm using terms like significant and like small but significant, basically what this means is we have kind of ways of measuring average change given the amount of variability that you could expect in the group and in the individual. So the amount of change was more than you might expect given this amount of error or variability. But we can also compare it to other clinical studies. So I did say that personality doesn't usually change. Well, it doesn't in healthy adults, but a few studies have shown that adults treated for depression with antidepressant treatment, the people who respond to antidepressant treatment do change in their personality in ways you might expect. They become less, they have lower neuroticism, so being moody, anxious, and depressed. They sometimes have higher extroversion, higher openness. So the picture of recovering from depression does look like a personality change, but it's not really that the identity is changing, but they're kind of the traits that they have accumulated as a result of this disease are shifting. So this is also so it's been done with antidepressants as well as for substance abuse rehabilitation, intensive talk therapy. Also changes personality. The changes that we saw are bigger than were seen in any of those clinical studies. This means that it's potentially significant in terms of people's lives, is as well as just, based on our statistics. It's also possible that if we had a clinical population who started lower in openness, that there'd be even bigger changes because they've got more room to increase. We just don't know.
Yeah, and this is something that Roland mentioned in our interview, and I want to mention here too, because this is also in the paper, is that, as it is said, correlational research has highlighted a role in addiction recovery and in coping with life-threatening illnesses such as cancer, which may account for the potential efficacy of psilocybin in the aforementioned treatment of addictions and cancer distress.
Mm-hmm.
See, to me, that's a very big deal here. And what first struck me when Roland and I were speaking about this, and again, as you're mentioning this, and as I read the paper, is this is not what my conservative reflexive background makes me want to do on the, oh, magic mushrooms. Well, it makes you feel good. Okay. I need to set that aside, and that is a challenge. That is something that, happily, thanks to meditation, I can observe this response coming up in my mind and say, you know what? Let me set that aside for a moment because that's confirmation bias, and see that although this is an induced experience, I don't really see anything wrong with that because in our meditation practice, which many of us know can be very transformative, particularly as we have experiences in those meditative states that do positively transform us, I don't see anything wrong with that. That's positively beneficial. And what we see here is that there is the possibility with further research to really get a better handle and understanding what's going on and why it is possible that people who do not only suffer from perhaps regular depression, but situational based depression, like I'm going through cancer treatments. And that may be particularly challenging, not just for the person who's going through it, but for their families as well. And having been in that situation, myself going through cancer, it is to know that there may be something at some point in the future that helps one deal with the challenges that presents, because those are sometimes as damaging and in some ways more damaging than the cancer itself, because we are in many cases able to treat cancer with surgery or chemo or whatever, but the ongoing effects of the depression that one gets from that experience, that may be more pervasive. And so to see that there is some possibility or areas of further research to help with that, to me is very, very encouraging.
Wow, a lot of stuff came up as I was listening to you talk. I mean, the therapeutic potential, I think, is without being kind of overly optimistic, I think that it's very large. And I do want to draw a distinction between kind of recreational um, use in an unsupported setting, kind of you may stumble upon a mystical experience. That has certainly happened to many people. And if you do it intentionally with a kind of spiritual framework, you are probably likely to stumble upon a mystical experience using psilocybin mushrooms. But along with that kind of comes this risk. These are scheduled compounds. They're currently illegal to use in the United States and in many countries around the world. There is a certain risk to unsupervised use that can basically negate the potential benefits.
Right, right.
And the way that we're kind of going about it here is trying to kind of maximize the safety, maximize the potential positive effects, although, of course, we can't promise that there are going to be positive outcomes. And plenty of volunteers go through the study who have a great experience, but maybe not life altering, not mystical. Um, and a lot of people have a challenging experience that can still be positive in the long run, but maybe not something someone would want to do again.
Yeah,
Uh,
the challenge that as you described, a challenging experience, it may not have even necessarily been a bad trip so much as this, what others would consider a good trip, really challenged some perceptions and ideas that a person may have had about their self with a capital S, and that in turn has triggered some some negative responses to the event.
right. The other things that came up for me, you were talking about kind of induced experiences, um, and knowing a little bit about you, I know that you understand the inherent funniness of saying what's induced and what's authentic.
Right,
So
right.
I'm chuckling to myself. I think that my thinking about what's an authentic experience has changed a bit as I've studied kind of meditation and also psilocybin. It is actually a really big thing that comes up for people when I talk about this is, well, is it authentic if, it's being caused by a chemical? I get what the point is, but I also would probably say that most of our consciousness is induced by something.
Yeah, exactly.
And there are very few pure experiences that aren't caused by anything. And in fact, I maybe we can put that out as our $1 million question. If someone in the audience can come up with a non-induced authentic experience, I'd like to hear what it
Yes, because that
is.
would be the first thing that is not within the realm of cause and effect.
Right. But the question of authenticity, I think, is answered by how people talk about these experiences. Um, they usually have a kind of a frank ability to say, I'm not deluded in thinking, this is going to fix all of my life's problems and now the world is totally different. The world is still the same world. You're going to return to that. But it's a fundamental shift in perspective that is due to an experience that, for all intents and purposes, is just as real and truthful as anything else you might experience in life. Now, of course, you can argue whether we should trust anything we experience in this life, in this way of kind of experiencing reality, but that's a bigger question. So,
It is, and that's we then tread into the realm of a philosophical question of the, well, let's suppose that everything is just an illusion, and of course the more modern version of that is we're all in the matrix. But the earlier philosophical ideas is, but we may be being controlled by a demon, and really everything that we experience in our lives is completely false. And really, what this gets us into, and we have this discussion fairly frequently in secular Buddhist circles, as people say, "Oh, but I had this experience," and what we typically respond is, absolutely. Of course you did. And it could have been very positively transformative and very compelling. Absolutely. No one is arguing that at all. And whether that's induced by I've been meditating for 10 years and bam, I hit a jhana that I had not hit before, or something, or kensho, or whatever the particular experience one has through one's own efforts that altered the brain's chemistry and neural pathways. And as we know, we are changing things in our brains physically, and just on the level of moment by moment changes, we know we're doing that. Or whether it was through psilocybin or some other causative agent, the experience still happens. We're still people. It's still transformative to us, regardless of the cause. The question is really then, are we going to make that a positive thing and carry that good and beneficial transformation forward in our own lives, in our interactions with others?
right.
That's where it gets really beneficial.
Yeah. And I do think that there are parallels here with meditation because I think the same challenges are faced with taking insights off the cushion and into the real world and not kind of getting sucked into this idea of, well, if I just spend all my time on the cushion and figure out the universe there, then it'll be okay somehow. It's like, no, the real world is still always waiting for you. It would like you to show up. And so what are you going to do now that you have this lifetime? You could do all sorts of things. So what are you going to do? And with psilocybin or meditation, I think for my own personal interest in these areas and also research wise, I think we're going to have to come up with better ways of saying, well, how are people impacting the world and themselves in a positive way, and really take a bigger perspective. Because I mean, I think that's what it's going to take for these things to become more, accepted as part of, you know, what our society is, without just being these fringe pursuits that, if you're lucky, you get into a study where it's safe to use these compounds, or if you have time, you meditate and you kind of go off into your little world and do that with the other people who meditate. And then there's all the rest of the people kind of in the middle who are just saying, what is all this stuff about? I don't even get it.
Yeah.
Um,
It's interesting that you bring up the positive effects in the world, because I did just uh, send an email note trying to get an interview with Steven Pinker, who has a book that's coming out shortly that's talking about though it may not seem like it to us, that statistically the violence is decreasing over the periods of human history. And one of the
hmm,
things that he credits that to is an increase in things like behaviors like kindness. And I really want to talk with him about that and get more into what he means by that, because, of course, that's a key component of our practice, and not just on the cushion doing our metta practice, or loving kindness practice, but in our interactions, as you said, off the cushion, taking it into the world and having those effects, those positive effects, ripple throughout. That's how we transform our culture and our society.
right.
Excellent. Well,
Um,
Catherine, I did want to ask you one more thing: is what's next? What studies are you thinking and plotting and planning on? What can you share with us?
well, let's see. We have one ongoing study that I think I mentioned last year that's still going strong, which combines psilocybin and daily meditation. And a lot of our volunteers are people who've never had experience with either before, and particularly a lot of people who have never meditated before. So, really kind of big transformations happening over the course of about 6 months as people learn to become familiar with their minds, and in more ways than one, sitting on the cushion and also during the psilocybin sessions. Um, and kind of looking at those longitudinal effects. And that study is still actively recruiting. It'll probably be another year until we meet our recruitment goal, but it's going well. And in terms of new, of course, we have a couple other studies that I'm sure Roland mentioned, for more clinical populations. One for people with a cancer diagnosis who are experiencing distress, or anxiety, sadness, kind of about their diagnosis, and other kind of health outcomes, as well as a small pilot study that Matt Johnson is running, looking at psilocybin for smoking, quitting smoking. And those are also both going well, still recruiting. In terms of kind of new ideas, I did mention that one kind of obvious next step with the openness finding is to look at things like creativity. Um, that's kind of uh, a big issue to tackle. I think it may be probably a couple years down the line to arrange the kind of the funding and think about what it would take to show that creativity had increased or something like that. But certainly something that a lot of us here are interested in doing eventually. More immediately, we kind of hinted at this in the discussion in this paper, and we're just talking about it now with terms of things like depression, more generally, so not specific to situational or another diagnosis. People struggling with things like major depression and potentially other mental conditions that are just refractory to treatment. Nothing else seems to be working. Nothing else has worked their whole lives. I think we have more of an interest in potentially kind of branching into that and seeing if psilocybin can have therapeutic benefits in populations who are not, functioning at their optimal level, like a lot of the participants in our kind of healthy volunteer studies. The openness findings suggest that it could be, in addition to other avenues, it could be kind of personality change that underlies some of those positive effects in situations like depression. So of course, we'll kind of continue to look at personality as one aspect of the changes. And yeah.
Interesting.
That's pretty much things are going.
It is. So there's lots of stuff going on. Now, this is at Johns Hopkins. Now, is this all part of the Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit?
This is.
All right. So folks who are interested in finding out more about that, the website address, and again, there will be a link to this and some of the things we've been talking about here today, like the previous episodes, is www.bpru.org. Katherine, anything else you'd like to mention?
No, I think we've covered it. I hope that this has opened some people's minds a little bit, thinking about this this topic that you probably may not have thought about too much. We're just kind of slowly doing small study after small study. Our list of ideas for studies is much longer than our ability to actually get them finished. But that's the fun of science. It kind of is a never-ending journey.
It is. Yeah, we're always learning. And as I tell people that I work with in a completely different area, you'll never be bored. That's kind of nice. Right. Well, Katherine MacLean, thank you again so much for being here. I really appreciate you reaching out and sharing with the listeners about this study that has just come out within the past couple of days.
Thanks, Ted. It was a pleasure, as always.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.